Hello and welcome to Chapter 7 of The Magic Lantern. And this chapter is called A Brutal Crime is Discovered. The next morning, Sandy was awoken by Jamie and Bobby, who came running into the little room, waving a newspaper in the air and causing such a commotion that the zookeeper appeared at the door to see what the matter was. "What are you little doing in here, eh?" he asked, eyeing Sandy dubiously. "It's all right, Harry. Tam said Sandy could stay here the night," Jamie lied in response to the zookeeper's scrutiny. Harry grunted. "Well, I suppose if Tam said it's all right, but don't let Mr. P catch him at it. You know how he feels about vagrants. Anyways, where's Tam? He didn't turn up last night for the 9 o'clock. Mr. P was raging, I can tell you. I had to get the old man up to work the Magic Lantern." "I haven't seen him since last night either," said Jamie, a little wistfully. "Well, when you do see him, you tell him Mr. P's looking for him." At that moment, Andrew came crashing into the room with a small, frail-looking boy with dark, scruffy hair just like Andrew's, but unlike Andrew in every other way. He wore glasses that were far too big for his face and made his brown eyes look huge in his tiny little face. And his legs were withered and so bent he had to walk with crutches. They didn't seem to hamper him though. He was just as quick as the other boy. "Well, if it isn't wee George," exclaimed Harry as he ruffled the small boy's hair. "Why are you not at your schooling today? Not like you to play truant. I thought mischief was your brother's department," he said, indicating Andrew. "I'm working for Mr. McBrain today, sir. My mum says that me sitting in school all day isn't going to bring in any food," George lied. He was playing truant, though it was true that his parents would prefer him to if he earned a wage. There wasn't many opportunities for boys like him, and Mr. McBrain was willing to give him a chance. He couldn't do the normal work of a delivery boy, but he was good with numbers, and Mr. McBrain had him do the bookkeeping and writing up the receipts for all the customers. Normally, school was where George preferred to be, or stowed away in a quiet corner with his nose in a book. When his brother Andrew had told him about the time-travelling visitor from the future, though, he had to come and meet them for himself. "You're smart, George. You could be a clerk or a banker or something. You're meant for more than us, so don't be hanging around with these louts for too long. Right, boys, I've got work to do, so don't get into any mischief. You hear?" said Harry. "We won't," replied Jamie, flashing the young zookeeper a bright smile beaming with innocence. Harry wasn't convinced. He harumphed and then sauntered off. Sandy stared at George. "Who's this guy?" she asked, nodding her head towards George. "Oh, he's just my wee brother. He had to come and meet you after what I told him happened last night," said Andrew. George nodded his head enthusiastically, his glasses almost flying off. He had barely slept at the prospect of meeting a real time traveller. The Time Machine was one of his favourite books. "You told him? You swore twice that you wouldn't tell another living soul," Sandy said furiously. "I didn't think that meant George. He's one of us, and he's got more brains than the rest of us put together. He might be able to help." "Help with what?" said Sandy. "Well, you know, the Magic Lantern and the message and how you get back to your own time," Andrew said. Sandy regarded the small boy who stared back at her with magnified brown eyes full of hope and excitement. He was really cute, and Sandy melted. "Well, I guess it's too late now anyway. He already knows, but no one else, okay?" "Yeah, no one else, I swear," Andrew promised, crossing his heart. "Is Tam back yet?" he said, changing the subject. "No, and this is in the papers today," Jamie said, waggling the newspaper he was holding in the air. "Listen, this is important. Brutal crime discovered in Glasgow. Defenceless old lady murdered a girl's ghastly discovery. Sandy looked at Jamie puzzled. What's that got to do with the magic lantern? Didn't say it did. Listen. Jamie continued reading, struggling over the words, spelling out each syllable until George impatiently snatched the paper out of his hands. Maybe if you actually went to school sometimes, you might learn something like how to read. He sarcastically sniped, pushed his glasses up his nose and continued to read the article out loud. Fluently gliding through the paragraphs of tiny newsprint, George recited how an old lady, Miss Marion Gilchrist, had been brutally murdered at about 6:30 p.m. the previous evening. Miss Gilchrist's maid, Nellie, had returned from an errand to find the downstairs neighbour, Mr. Adams, waiting at her mistress's front door. He had heard a banging from the apartment above and was concerned that the old lady had fallen. Hastening to open the door, the maid and Mr. Adams entered the hallway as a stranger came with nonchalance from the lighted interior of one of the back rooms, passed the couple with greatest coolness, and walked swiftly downstairs. His unconcernedness was astounding. He impressed Adams and the girl with the air of an ordinary visitor. A few minutes more, and the servant maid became hysterical at the awful result of the visit. The spectacle was full of frights and the contrast of the dead and the living, and it repeated itself to those whose courage or official duty prompted them to regard it. The blaze of gaslight in the old-fashioned dining room was vivid. Nearly everything was undisturbed and spoke of the taste of a lady of refined and careful habits. The body, as it had fallen under the blows of the murderer, lay rigid before a living fire whose light kept the death pallor out of her lined and worn old face. The black dress was scarcely ruffled. The head alone indicated the brutality of the assault. The skull was battered in. The listening boys gasped. The cheeks hacked and an eye dislodged. "Cool, gruesome," exclaimed Bobby with fascinated glee. George continued. Spots of blood darkened the steel of the grate and pieces of brain tissue were scattered about. An open coal box by the fireplace was the only object broken. It was splashed with the blood and torn at the hinges as if the body in falling had crashed against it. Sandy felt sick. She was pretty sure that newspapers didn't write stuff that graphic in the 21st century. As he left the house, continued George, Adams, with the maid's horrified screams still ringing in his ears, rushed down the stairs but immediately lost sight of the man. The glimpse that he had received was that of a man dressed in a pale-coloured overcoat, a cloth cap, beneath which he was gaunt like a skeleton, a true spectre of death. That's a horrible story. Poor old lady. But what's it got to do with anything? Asked Sandy when George had finished reading. Jamie's brother Tam, replied George, and Jamie nodded in agreement. His girlfriend is Miss Gilchrist's maid, Nellie. Oh, said Sandy. Aye, and Tam was up at St. George's Cross last night picking up this week's moving pictures. He could have been in the West End at the time of the murder happened. He was. I saw him when I was delivering a bill with Mr. McBrain. He and Nellie were kissing outside the newsagents at St. George's Cross. George's eyes suddenly widened. You don't think he saw the murderer and the murderer? George paused and looked at Jamie and Bobby, who stared back at him with expressions of mounting horror. George cautiously continued. Done him in? Jamie's face suddenly brightened. He couldn't have been murdered. He was back here for the 7:30 show. We saw him at the Magic Lantern. He seemed fine, didn't he? Jamie looked at his brother Bobby for confirmation. Aye, Bobby replied. Then Tam is probably fine, George continued. Maybe he went back to the West End to look for Nellie after the shock of finding the old lady dead like that. Aye, said Jamie. That must be where he is. It could be Miss Gilchrist's ghost haunting the Magic Lantern, said Andrew suddenly. Sandy and the boys looked at him puzzled. Well, I was just thinking that Tam knew old Miss Gilchrist and he was working the Magic Lantern last night, and it's funny how Sandy appeared in the beam not long after the old lady was murdered, and what the Magic Lantern projected last night could be a clue to the identity of her murderer. They all thought about this for a minute in the ensuing silence. You know, I think Andrew's right. Maybe Miss Gilchrist was using the Magic Lantern to tell Tam who her murderer is, and you appearing in the beam last night like that surely means that somehow you are connected with it too, he said, looking at Sandy. How can I possibly be connected with something that happened over 100 years in my past? Asked Sandy. I don't know, replied George. Perhaps you're here to solve the murder. But why me? I don't know anything about solving murders except what I've seen on TV. Why would the ghost of a murdered old lady pick on me? George thought about this for a moment. Well, there must be some reason you've been sent through time, and it surely can't be a coincidence that you appeared soon after she was murdered. So maybe we should try and solve the murder, and we could start by... Start what? Interrupted Sam as he entered the room with Charlie. Oh, Miss Gilchrist was murdered and Nellie found her dead body, and Andrew and George think that Sandy might be here because he has to solve the murder, summarised Jamie. I know about the murder, said Sam, passing the bag full of newspapers slung over his shoulder. Gruesome, eh? Is Tam back? No, said Jamie. We reckon he's gone to look after Nellie. She must have been pretty upset after finding the old lady like that. So are we going to investigate the murder then? Asked Charlie. Yes, said George, but first I want to see the Magic Lantern working and see if it has any more messages or clues. Sandy and the boys snuck into the still-closed music hall and over to the haunted projector. It seems like a perfectly ordinary magic lantern to me, said George with the tone of a knowledgeable adult inspecting it thoroughly. Then he turned to Sandy and instructed her to stand on the stage on the very spot where she had arrived the previous evening. Once she was in position, George flicked the switch and the lamp behind the lens cast its light onto Sandy, who stood on the stage with her eyes tight shut, bracing herself for the sudden jolting drop again. Nothing happened. Her feet remained firmly planted on the sticky wooden floor. She opened her eyes and looked behind her. She couldn't see the message either. Is anything happening? She called across to the others who were all crowded around the magic lantern. No, I don't think so. Not yet anyway. Do you think we have to do something else? What did you do to make the magic lantern send you back here? George shouted at her as he hovered over the magic lantern looking for some kind of hidden lever or switch. I didn't do anything. I woke up and the magic lantern was on, and when I stood up it zapped me back here, she replied. And when you all saw the message, what did you do then? George asked the boys. Nothing, other than turn it on. Well, I did wiggle this bit on the end, said Jamie, pointing to the thick brass cylinder that pulled the lens into focus. George began to twist it, like this. That's right, replied Jamie. They all stared at the back cloth, but the blue sky of the Highland scene remained just that, a clear blue sky. No letters appeared. Maybe the ghost is sleeping, suggested Andrew. And that's it for Chapter 7. If you want to know what happens next, tune in for Chapter 8 on the first Thursday of June. See you then.